let's go watch it in 2D. No, let's go watch it in 3D. But if we watch it in 3D, then is it worth the cost?
Hello. This is Adolph Vega, and today I'm doing an interview with 3D Archive. And I have on the phone with me Mr. Bob Furmanek.
How are you, Adolph?
I'm doing fine. Sorry to mispronounce your name.
It's okay. I'm used to it.
So let's start with some basic information, Bob. So what do you do?
Well, I am founder and CEO of the 3D Film Archive, which is an organization that saves, restores, and preserves vintage 3D motion pictures. I began doing the work about 1980, and we have, in the last 5 or 6 years, begun releasing our material on 3D Blu-ray. And to date, we've got 12 titles available and a 13th, lucky 13th, due on August 28th when Universal releases the Creature Legacy Collection, and that's going to contain our 4K restoration of Revenge of the Creature. So it's been quite an interesting journey the last 4 decades or so, and I have to say my goal from day one has always been to kind of rescue these films, get them out of the vault and seen again, and it's really, really very gratifying to now have the opportunity to get them onto 3D Blu-ray in a quality that is comparable to how they were originally seen in the 1950s, and allow people the chance to enjoy them in the comfort of their home.
Okay, great. So what's the process of converting these older 3D movies to Blu-ray? Do you contact the movie studios? Do they contact you? Is there studios that you don't work with or you do work with? How does that work?
Well, it's a little complicated in that the rights to the vintage films are all over the map. I mean, there were in the 1950s there were exactly 50 domestic English language 3D features, and they're all at different studios. They're at Sony, Universal, Fox, Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, and it's really due to the efforts of Kino Lorber, and I have to acknowledge Frank Tarzi and Richard Lorber for believing in our goal and working to try to license as many of these films for Blu-ray release as possible. The licensing is a huge aspect of that, and it's something that when we first began to reach out around 2010, 2011, we couldn't get our foot in the door because nobody knew who we were, really. And I know in one case I spoke with some people at Paramount, and they told me to license one of their 3D films, we were talking $30,000 just to license it. So that was well beyond our very modest budget, and it really was Frank Tarzi that took a chance with us on our first title, which was Dragonfly Squadron through Olive Films, and that started the ball rolling. And Richard Lorber told me when I met with him in 2013, he understood our goals and our desire to rescue these films, and he said, I am happy to do what I can to help you. He said, I don't want to lose money, obviously, but I'm happy to break even. And if we can make a few bucks, even the better. And, here we are 5 years later, and every single one of our titles is in the black. So it's been a very successful endeavor for everybody involved, and it's all based on what licenses are available, what rights are available. We've had a couple of unfortunate incidents where companies have picked up rights to 3D films but because there isn't an existing 3D master, they've either released it flat or we called enough attention to it that they scrapped the idea of releasing a 3D film flat. That happened with Shout Factory and Bwana Devil. So it's a multi-step process, but what's important to remember is that prior to 2012 or 13, there were no existing digital masters of any of these films. They have all had to be newly scanned, and that means going back to the original 35 millimeter left-right elements, because the films were photographed with two cameras, so you would have a left eye and a right eye view. Those elements then have to be scanned, and what we do is take those raw left-right scans and recombine them. And in that process, we optimize the balance between the left-right views, make sure that the light level is consistent, contrast, color, all the grading that goes in timing the film. And we also correct vertical misalignment. And the best way I can describe that to you is that if you look at an image with both eyes, the vertical has to be aligned. Otherwise, one eye's looking up and the other eye's looking down. Well, in the 1950s, and with these very cumbersome camera rigs that were, in some cases, put together very quickly to photograph these movies, sometimes that vertical is a little bit off. So our technical director, who is a brilliant engineer by the name of Greg Kintz, he takes these left-rights and matches the verticals so that in many ways what you're seeing on Blu-ray now is superior in quality to what was seen in the theaters in 1953 and 54. And we're not changing the intent of the filmmakers. We never adjust or change the horizontal image placement, which is basically setting where the 3D image is within the stereo window. But by correcting the vertical, we're basically fixing the baked-in errors that have been there from day one. So I know it's kind of a cliche to say that the films look better now than they did originally, but in these cases, they really do.
That's great. How big is your team? How long does it take you to convert one movie?
Well, the team is relatively small. There are four people that we work together on these projects. I kind of oversee everything. Greg Kintz, based in Indiana, is our technical director who does all the magic in recombining and matching these left-right elements. Thad Komorowski is our digital restoration artist, and what Thad does is takes these 65-year-old elements and cleans all the dirt and damage and wear that are on these negatives or fine grains or interpositives. And the fourth member is Jack Theakston, who is a brilliant color analyst, and he's worked very closely with us, especially on our latest project, which is a Paramount film called Sangaree. It was very early single-strip Eastman color negative, and 65 years later, there's a severe amount of fading in every shot. And what was very complicated with Sangaree is the left eye was faded differently from the right. So it was an enormous challenge to color match that and bring that back to life. And that was something where Jack was very instrumental in working with Greg shot by shot to restore the color. And other things that Jack does is we always place the intermission in the film because that's how these films were meant to be seen. The creative team, the filmmakers, the producer, writer, director knew that at some point at about 45 to 55 minutes within the film, there had to be a break. And the reason for that is the 35mm projection at that time could only accommodate about 6,000 feet of film on one reel and one carbon arc rod for the lamp house. So the films were basically scripted with a natural break, and those have not been seen in 6 decades, and in some cases the original intermission cards are no longer exist. So what Jack has done on a number of the films is recreate them based on the original fonts used in the titles. When possible, we have the isolated background plates from the credits, so we're able to basically put back what had been there when the films were first seen. So it's a small group, but we're really fortunate in that everybody that's on the team is extremely talented and very dedicated and very loyal, and you couldn't buy a better team really for bringing these films back to life.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I always thought the intermission was just a convenient excuse to get more food.
Well, that was a nice little side benefit for sure, because once they broke for intermission, it was usually about a 7 or 10 minute break in the show. So yeah, I'm sure the concession stands got a lot of activity, and I bet the theater owners were happy of that.
Okay, have you ever considered converting lost 3D movies like Top Banana? Is it possible to fix that movie?
Yes, it is possible, and we have certainly thought about it, but it's very sobering when you actually realize what the cost of a good conversion is. And by good conversion, I'm talking about something that is carefully done, and a great example of that would be The Wizard of Oz, or Titanic, where you spend time on every shot to create a 3D image from a flat image. That's not only very time consuming, it's very expensive. And we have a number of 3D films that are lost where we have one side, including one of the very first 3D films ever shown in 1922, and it's called Selected Views of Yosemite Valley. And it was a single reel, about a 6 or 7 minute short, that was made to be played with the very first 3D feature, The Power of Love. Well, we have one side of the Yosemite short, and we looked into converting it when we were planning to put material together for our 3D Rarities set in 2015. And the best price we can get was $25,000 per minute.
Oh.
So, if you do the math, we're looking at $150,000 to do a 6 minute short.
Yeah.
That was a little bit out of our price range, so that didn't happen. Top Banana, I would love to see restored. It is the only completely lost 3D feature from the 1950s, and it's a wonderful filmed record of a very popular stage show that played around the country with Phil Silvers. But it's a 100-minute film. I mean, you'd be talking millions of dollars, and quite frankly, you'd never make that back. I mean, it would have to be somebody with really, really deep pockets who's, just a huge Phil Silvers fan that would want to invest in that, and it's realistically just not going to happen.
Or a big fan of 3D like James Cameron.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's got the money to do it, but I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, last year I watched the 3D conversion of Terminator 2, and it looks fantastic. And I was just surprised because, it never was intended to be in 3D, but what they were able to do with the time craft, it just looked so great in 3D. And the movie is a classic, I think. So.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's a lot of time and care was put into it. We were at Warner Brothers when they were about to release The House of Wax on 3D Blu-ray, And Ned Price showed us some clips from their recently 3D converted The Wizard of Oz, and it blew us away. It looked as if they were on the set with a serial camera. It was that well done. But that's Warner Brothers, and Wizard of Oz is one of their evergreens. So there was no issue for them to invest the millions into it. But for most other films, that just wouldn't be financially viable.
So why are there so many lost 3D movies? Is it just people not taking care of the film, or what?
Well, truthfully, Adolph, there's not that many. If you look at the list and kind of break it down, most of the lost 3D films are from the silent era, and the survival rate of nitrate films from the 1920s and so is very poor to begin with. The things that are lost in the 1950s were mostly industrial type films, and some great stuff that I would love to find. But overall, the survival rate for the Hollywood product, which would be the 50 features and a couple of dozen shorts and cartoons, the survival rates were very good. So there's not all that much lost in the grand scheme of things. And a big part of that, like you said, it was just neglect. Once these films had their initial 3D exhibition, whether it was theatrical in the silent era or the industrial films, which were shown at trade shows and things like that, they just figured these were, they were not needed any longer, and they just were not saved, and that's the sad case with a lot of lost films. It's just they're lost because of neglect.
So, obviously these movies are really old. Have any of the original filmmakers been alive to see and comment on what you restored, or have any commentary at all from anyone in staff or anything like that?
Unfortunately not, and that is because of the age of the films. Ironically, the one we've just finished and which will be released in October by Kino Lorber is Paramount's first 3D movie called Sangaree. And in that case, the leading lady is still alive. In fact, she just celebrated, I believe, her 94th birthday. And that's the very beautiful and talented Arlene Dahl. But as far as, and there are some selected cast members still alive, of course, from the films of the 1950s. But in terms of creative people, the people behind the camera and behind the scenes, there's just nobody left. And that's just, the sadness of dealing with something that's 6 decades and more into the past. So it's just not possible. The only time I had any direct interaction, I met Jack Arnold many, many years ago. He was a director who did things like Creature from the Black Lagoon and It Came from Outer Space and The Glass Web. And he was wonderful, but I met him when I was 20 years old. I had no idea that, 3 decades later I'd be working on these things. So there wasn't really much discussion about that. I was really proud to present the premiere in England of Mickey Spillane's I, the Jury. That was a classic 1953 3D film that was photographed by the amazing John Alden. And it had never played England in 3D. It played flat when it was first released. And I had the only existing print in 1999 when the BFI was going to have a Mickey Spillane tribute. So I was flown over with the print, and Mr. Spillane was there. And that was a tremendous thrill because he's a legend. And it was one of those things where we were introduced, and he was really fascinated with how I'd found this print And I told him the story, and then when he found out that I was from New Jersey and he was from New Jersey, we clicked, and he took me to dinner that night, and it was a really, really wonderful moment. Another case was the movie Inferno. That was a 20th Century Fox 3D film that starred Robert Ryan, Rhonda Fleming, and William Lundigan, and it was photographed by Roy Baker. And I knew a gentleman in England by the name of Tony Sloman, who had worked in the industry for a lot of years, and he was doing some proofreading on Roy Baker's autobiography. And in his biography, Mr. Baker was talking about Inferno and how proud he was of the film. And he didn't believe a 3D print had survived, primarily because they had a tribute to him at the BFI a few years, I think around 1993 or 4. And they were reduced to showing a 16mm black and white copy of this, originally vibrant Technicolor 3D film. And he wrote that in his book. And when he found out that I had a surviving 35mm left-right Technicolor print, he actually had them change the text in the book to modify it to indicate that a print had survived. And he got my number and he called me from England, and we talked about 20 minutes about his experience directing the film and shooting on location. And he was fascinated with how this private collector in New Jersey had a 3D print. So those were wonderful moments, but they happened nearly 20 years ago. And these gentlemen were in their 70s and 80s then. So flash forward to 2018, and there's just really nobody around still that worked on that.
Okay. Is there any chance of seeing movies like Money from Home or Son of Sinbad getting that 3D restoration?
Well, Money from Home is a real kind of ambitious restoration for me, because I worked for Jerry Lewis and we were friends for over 35 years. And I tried real hard to get that onto 3D Blu-ray when Olive Films had picked up the license. Paramount did not have a 3D master. They had the elements, however, but there was no money in the budget to go back to these Technicolor separation masters to do new scans. But I had worked out a deal with an existing 3D print. We were going to access it and scan the print, and I had gotten all these people kind of on the same page to bring it together and make it happen. And because it was sort of a labor of love for us, and Jerry Lewis was, given his blessing to it, we were going to bring it in for about $7,000, which is unbelievably inexpensive. And at the 11th hour, Olive pulled the plug on it and decided that they didn't want to spend $7,000 for this, new 3D master. So they released it flat. And that was a major disappointment to me, because I'd worked so hard to make it happen. And ironically, if we had been able to proceed, it would have been out on Blu-ray before Jerry Lewis had passed, so he would have seen it at least get released, but it didn't happen. That being said, you never dwell on your disappointments, and you look ahead, and I always try to be optimistic. And I can say that there is some dialogue now with Paramount, and there is a possibility that something might happen down the road with Money from Home. So don't give up on it. And we certainly haven't. And I'm committed to trying to get that, because it's not a great Martin and Lewis film. It's, mid-range, I would say. But in 3D, it really, really comes to life. It's beautifully photographed by Daniel Pfapp. It was one of only 2 films photographed with the 3D Technicolor camera rig. And that was a very expensive production because you had two Technicolor cameras interlocked. So you were shooting yellow, cyan, and magenta separations on each side. So you had, for every take, you had 6 rolls of film going through the camera. And it was a very hot set. Jerry Lewis told me that he remembered a lot of lights, a lot of equipment, and it was the first Martin and Lewis film to be in Technicolor, and it was also the most expensive Martin and Lewis film to date. It was a $2 million production, which was, you know, a lot of money in 1953. So we're committed to getting that done. Son of Sinbad is at Warner Brothers. It's never been seen in 3D, despite someone who claims in a book that it was. That's wrong information. It never had a 3D release. The elements do survive, and I wish I had more information, but we don't know if, at this stage of the game, Warner Brothers has any future 3D plans. They did beautiful restorations of Dial M for Murder, House of Wax, and Kiss Me Kate, but things just sort of stopped there, and it's been quiet. So I don't know if Warner's is looking at doing any other 3D restorations for Blu-ray, and that's kind of sad because they're sitting on about a dozen really good vintage titles from the Warner Brothers, RKO, and MGM library. So hopefully that'll change, but as of right now, I don't know if anything is in the works.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
This podcast is brought to you by 3D Wiggle. With 3D Wiggle software, you can impress your family and friends with 3D gifts and videos. To find out more information, please click on the link in the description for 20% off coupon as well. This podcast is also brought to you by Patreon. With Patreon, you can become a patron and get this podcast commercial-free and get many more benefits. Please click on the description again to get more information. Now, back to the show.
Any chance of a full restoration of Jaws 3D? That's a little bit newer for you. I think the 70s, right, when they came out, or 80s?
80, yeah, I think that was 82. Yeah, Jaws, the elements exist. Universal did kind of a quick down and dirty scan and recombine on it, which they didn't spend much time on. So all of the vertical misalignment is still there. And it's on 3D Blu-ray. I mean, it's part of a Jaws set, I think, with the other films. It can look a lot better, though. They really didn't do any cleanup or work on it. They just sort of slapped it onto a digital master. And it's available, and people can certainly buy it, but it can look better. And as far as work on it, I don't know. It's not one that has been mentioned to us as a possibility. And kind of the fact that it's already out there, I'm not optimistic. See, that's one of the things that's really important. These films are more or less going to get one shot at a 3D master. And we've tried really hard to convince the studios and copyright holders that it really makes sense to do it right the first time and get it out looking as good as it can. We haven't always been successful, though, and Jaws and Amityville 3D and what's the third one? I'm drawing a blank now. Shout put it out. It's from Universal. Is it Metal Storm, I believe? And they put it out with a disclaimer at the beginning of the transfer saying that, well, this is the best element. Well, that's really not true. It can look a lot better, but they just didn't spend the time to make it look better.
Now, when people buy your Blu-rays, are they like region free, or is it only for the U.S. markets? Because there's a big worldwide demand for 3D, and
Well, we on the films that we own, such as Dragonfly Squadron, The Bubble, 3D Rarities, they're always region free, because our idea is we want everyone around the world to have the opportunity to see these in 3D on Blu-ray. We're not always that successful, though, with licensed projects, where we are basically work for hire. And that's primarily because the region-free rights are not available. Kino was very successful in securing Blu-ray rights to the Paramount films, most of them anyway, but they were only available for Region 1. So at that point, the choice was, well, do you do it for Region 1 and at least get it out on 3D Blu-ray that way, or do you not do it at all? And I think with the idea that now is the time and the opportunity to finally get these restored in 3D, and, you know, people can get region-free Blu-ray players for, you know, what, $150, $200, it seems like a no-brainer. You do it no matter what, and it's really up to the buyer, if they're in Region 2 and 3, to invest in a multi-region player so they could see these things.
Now, where can they buy your Blu-rays from?
Pretty much any online source. Amazon, I suppose, would be the, you know, best way, because they stock everything that we do. And, you know, I know Kino Lorber also sells their titles, and they have occasional sales, which are a great opportunity if you can wait after, you know, 65 years, if you can wait another few months or a year. In fact, someone just told me that they're selling Ceasefire, which is an amazing 3D film done in 1953, actually in Korea, just a few miles from the fighting. It's, I believe, right now on sale with Kino for $11.99, and I think that sale runs until the end of August. But yeah, they're out there. Amazon, I suspect, would be the easiest one-stop site for picking up all of our releases.
You can't buy it directly from 3D Archive.
No, we didn't. When we set this up, you know, we're not set up to handle credit cards and things like that. I've got enough of a full plate with restoration work, and, you know, we didn't want to go that route.
What do you consider your top 3 Golden Age 3D movies?
In terms of what was done in the 50s, or the restorations that we've done recently?
Just in the 50s overall.
Well, I guess you have to put House of Wax right up at the top, because it was the first major studio 3D film, and it really was lightning in a bottle. They got everything right out of the gate on that, and it's an amazing 3D production with great photography. The camera work is beautiful. You know, if you love vintage horror, it's a great story with Vincent Price. You've got a young Charles Bronson in there as Igor. I mean, you can't go wrong with that. So I would have to say House of Wax. Kiss Me Kate is an incredible MGM musical photographed in 3D. It's widescreen as well, and stereophonic sound, which is, you know, always a great experience on a film of that vintage. And the third one, boy, I guess Creature from the Black Lagoon. You know, you'd have to, an iconic Universal monster. Again, beautifully photographed, underwater 3D, and it's a classic, either flat or in 3D. But really, in 3D, it adds so much to the experience of the film that it's like all of these. You know, even films that may not have a great reputation, and we've certainly worked on a number of those, when you see them as they were intended to be seen, 3D, widescreen, a lot of these were composed for widescreen in those days, stereophonic sound. There were about, I think 15 or 16 of these that had 3-channel stereophonic sound originally. it really makes a difference, and it brings the film to life. And I think that's a great way to experience a film that is so vintage, but yet in some ways seems very modern with the way that it was photographed.
Now, how do you pronounce 3D? Is it 3-D or just 3D?
Well, I've never said dash, so I guess it would have to be 3D. I mean, I've seen it written both ways, but it's one or the other. It kind of gets the point across either way.
Because I think I've seen in many of the older movies they would have the dash in there, but like newer ones will only not have it. So
yeah, it's either one. I tend to do it with the dash, but that's because all the material I'm working with is from that era, and that's how it was spelled at that time.
So why are you a fan of 3D?
Well, I think for me it goes back to when I first learned about these films. I was about 11 or 12 years old, and you couldn't see any of these things at that time. This was in the early and mid-1970s. And the only way you could see these films were on TV, flat. And there was something about missing out on that experience that interested me, and even at that early age kind of challenged me to, okay, how do I get to see these films in 3D? Ironically, it was Money from Home was the first time I watched a film on TV. It was the network premiere, and the very next day I had gotten this magazine I sent for that was published by a gentleman in Texas who was a 3D collector. And I didn't know Money from Home was a 3D film. It didn't say it in the credits. Most of them did not. So I saw this on a Sunday night at the movies on, I think, ABC. Monday I get this magazine and I'm flipping through it and I see all these ads. And I see, wait a minute, Money from Home is in 3D? How is that possible? And why didn't I see it that way? And that kind of cemented the idea in my head that, okay, we're not seeing these films as you're supposed to see them. So that started it. And, for me it was a challenge. And I'm very grateful that we've gotten to the point now where we can get these things restored and available so, people that have the capability with 3D Blu-ray can see them as the filmmakers meant them to be seen.
How do you feel about the recent decline of 3D Blu-ray? 4K discs are coming around and most of them don't have 3D, and many modern 3D movies are not even releasing in the U.S. anymore. Is it just part of the market, or how do you feel?
Well, I think 3D movies were always, they always ran in cycles. And the late Dan Sims, who was a 3D fan and expert, used to say that a 3D movie is like a circus. It's great fun, but would you want to go every week? And, I think 3D always has these kind of peaks and valleys, and actually this latest renaissance has lasted far longer than any of the previous 3D cycles. I think it's tragic that as we, got to the point where the displays improved and the projectors improved, I picked up an OLED about, I guess, 2 years ago, and I was absolutely blown away with the quality of the 3D image. And it's really a shame that the display manufacturers, at least, abandoned the format just when the quality had reached such a high point. Of course, you can still get projectors. I'm using an Epson, which looks amazing and great even for flat projection because of the image quality and the black levels and everything. And, there are people now that are viewing 3D Blu-rays with the VR headsets. And that's another way for people to experience. So, it's unfortunate that the display manufacturers gave up on it. But I'd like to think that at some point in the not too distant future that there will be some kind of a breakthrough, maybe with glasses-free technology, if it can improve a little bit, and it'll come back again. It just needs another little kick in the arm. But I always say to anyone who is pessimistic about the future that there will be no shortage over the next several years of product from us on 3D Blu-ray. We're super busy right now. We've got about 10 or 12 restorations in the pipeline. So there's a lot coming over the course of the next several years on 3D Blu-ray, at least for vintage product. And there's a lot to look forward to. Unfortunately, because of agreements with the licenses and copyright holders, I can't really disclose any of the titles until they're ready to announce it, but take my word for it, there's some really, really cool vintage stuff coming in the next couple of years on 3D Blu-ray.
Do you have any interesting stories from the preservation side of that you have to share?
Oh, I mean, it's all over the map. I mean, every film presents challenges, and it's always interesting when you get the next project on the board, because you never know what you're going to get with the scans and what you're going to find. I mentioned Sangaree. That was an enormous challenge for us. In many ways, our most difficult restoration. Normally, we will get through a feature in about 3 months, and Sangaree was on the operating table for 5 months. So we had no way to know before we got the scans what we were going to have to deal with. So it keeps you on your toes, and I have to say Greg Kintz is absolutely brilliant with what he does, because every film presents new challenges. And Greg is a guy that if he sees something that he's never encountered before, he finds a way to make it work and fix it. He never gives up. So yeah, it's been quite a wild ride the last 4 or 5 years, and I look forward to many, many more opportunities to work with these elements and bring them back to life.
Have you ever thought about doing a classic 3D re-release of specific films via, the limited run special events like the Fathom movie events or the Alamo Draft House special events? That way people can just go to the theater and see it in 3D themselves like that?
Yeah, we have. In fact, when we did 3D Rarities in 2015, we had a pretty aggressive effort to get theatrical dates on that. We had our premiere at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it sold out. And we found the film really played well with an audience. We were able to, get quite a few bookings with it through Flickr Alley. But it's difficult on the licensed product because, as I mentioned, we're sort of a work for hire, and it's really up to Paramount or Kino Lorber, say, if they're going to try to push something like Those Redheads from Seattle or Ceasefire. And, the thing I've found over the years with any vintage film revivals is a lot of people are kind of reluctant to take a chance on something they've never heard of. You can do really well with a revival of Casablanca or The Wizard of Oz, or 2001. But you try to put something out there that's, also a really good film like The Glass Web or Inferno or Ceasefire, and, people look at you like you have two heads, like, well, I've never heard of this film, why would we want to play it in a theater? So it's easier said than done, unfortunately, and quite honestly, our primary efforts right now are just to get the films licensed and restored, and then let kind of the chips fall when they may with theatrical life after that. And the DCPs are available. In fact, the American Cinematheque just ran a couple of our things out at the Aero Theater in Santa Monica. But we're not aggressively trying to market stuff for theatrical, to answer your question.
What golden age 3D movie do you think would actually be something that fans would be interested in a remake or a reboot? I think the Black Lagoon might be pretty cool to bring back. What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of great scripts and stories. I think Inferno is a terrific story. In fact, it was remade in the 70s as a TV movie called Ordeal. Yeah, I think there's that possibility. But just with a lot of the films now being action-based and superhero-based, there's not a lot of that in the vintage film. It Came from Outer Space is a fantastic script based on a story by Ray Bradbury, and that's something that I think is timeless, really. But I just don't see much of that happening, unfortunately, right now.
Now, what about 4K discs? Can they make 3D 4K HDR, or is that just not possible? I don't see any of those happening right now.
I'm not entirely sure technically what they're capable of right now, so I really couldn't answer that question. I don't know.
Are you worried about other 3D movies in the present not getting, re-released and, maybe having current movies being lost because, they've never released the 3D Blu-ray?
No, I don't think that will happen because there's a much greater effort on the studios and copyright holders to save and back up current product. I think with the older stuff that is lost, again, it was just kind of the apathy of once these films had their 3D exhibition, they weren't considered viable really any longer. I don't think you have that now. I think there's enough of a understanding that anything, even the most obscure thing, might have a life down the line for either home release or syndication or something. So I don't think there'll be anything lost from the current wave of 3D films.
Can you tell me more about the upcoming release of The Revenge of the Creature?
Yes, that is coming from Universal. It's part of the Creature Legacy Collection Blu-ray release, which is for the first time on Blu-ray all 3 films in the Creature trilogy. And 2 of those are in 3D, the first 2, Creature from the Black Lagoon and Revenge of the Creature. We did the restoration on Revenge of the Creature, and we had 4K scans from NBC Universal. And the film needed a lot of work because when it went into production in mid-1954, 3D movies were pretty much dead at the box office. And someone at the studio had made the decision to take apart their underwater 3D rig that they had built for the first film. So they quickly put something together and hadn't quite worked the bugs out of it when they took it to Florida to do location shooting. So there's a higher than average amount of flat shots in the film just based on camera malfunctions and things like that. The usual vertical misalignment. We fixed as much of that as we could. One thing that we cannot fix that are baked in on these films are occasional examples of shots being out of phase. And that's where the cameras were in synchronization, but the shutters were off. And you might have the shutter opening on the left camera at a different point than the right. That's really not fixable. And what it shows on screen is kind of a watery image. It's not a synchronization issue, but the image doesn't look 100% natural. And you could certainly watch a 3D shots that are out of phase without having a eye strain or headache. It just doesn't look right, and there's a fair amount of that in Revenge of the Creature that we were not able to fix. But all of the vertical corrections have been made. There were also a number of shots where the editor inadvertently cut the left film into the right negative and vice versa. So we have fixed all of that to keep the film correctly aligned. And it really looks better now than people saw it back in 1955. So that's part of the set. And the third film, which was The Creature Walks Among Us, is not 3D, but it's been mastered for the first time in its correct widescreen aspect ratio for the Blu-ray. So it's a great set. I mean, and who doesn't love The Creature from the Black Lagoon? So it's really a good opportunity to get the whole series in one collection. And then our next release will be Sangaree. That'll be October 16th from Kino. And beautiful Technicolor production, Fernando Lamas and Arlene Dahl. And that looks quite remarkable. But again, that had a lot of challenges. One of them being that a good amount of footage cut into the negative was dupe negative footage for the various fades and opticals and dissolves, things like that. And there's a total of 18 minutes per side of that dupe negative footage. So you've got 18 of 94 minutes consisting of dupe negative. And unfortunately, that material, it never looked good, even in original 1953 prints, because I used to have one. And it was always washed out and grainy and dirty. And now those 65-year-old dupe negatives are totally faded. And the best way I could compare that is if you've ever taken a faded photograph into Photoshop and try to bring back the color, you know it's almost impossible to replace color that's not there. And that was one of the things that on Sangaree was such a challenge, but I'm pretty pleased with the results, and I think what you're going to see now is the best it can ever look. But it's a 94-minute film, so you've got 18 minutes of dupe negative, and you've got 76 minutes of camera original. And the camera original looks absolutely sensational. And it's a beautifully photographed film, well mounted and well designed for depth. So I think people are going to really, really be surprised with the content and the story. It's a good script based on a novel that was very popular at the time. So those are our next two releases, and we're working on a follow-up to 3D Rarities, which will be coming early next year from Flicker Alley, and it's going to be another 2.5 hours of lost, rare, and obscure 3D films dating back to, in this case, the early 1940s. So we're kind of working on that as well to get that ready for release. And I think I'm optimistically going to say spring of 2019 for that release through Flicker Alley.
What was in the first 3D Rarities?
Well, that was 2.5 hours of all kinds of obscure, unusual shorts dating back to 1922. Or actually 24, I'm sorry. And it's an incredible collection. It's actually been our most successful release. And there's all kinds of great stuff on there. And I always tell people, with all the content, if you don't like the film you're watching, just sit tight because, you know, they're shorts. They're anywhere from 4 to maybe 12, 14 minutes each. But you've got things like Thrills for You, which was done for the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1940, a fascinating look at train travel at that time. You've got New Dimensions, which was the first domestic Technicolor film, and it was a stop-motion animated look at the building of Chrysler, full-size automobile. and that was done for the 1940 World's Fair in New York. There's a lot of interesting stuff from the 1950s, including the only 3D newsreel, and that was a boxing match between Rocky Marciano and Jersey Joe Walcott. There's an anti-atomic testing film shot in Nevada during the atomic tests of the spring of 1953, and that's called Doomtown. There's the Casper cartoon called Blue Moon, which is a brilliant widescreen Technicolor animated cartoon from 1953. It's a terrific collection. I mean, it's really anybody that has an interest in 3D and the history of 3D really needs to have it in their collection. I can't recommend it enough.
Now, on your website, 3dfilmarchive.com, you have so much fantastic materials, like in different pictures from back in the day, different newspaper clippings. Do the movie studios give this to you, or you have to find it? How do you get all this awesome content on your site?
No, that's material that I've kind of saved and collected over the last 30 or 40 years. It's a lifetime of collecting there. The studios don't have a lot of that stuff, ironically. And, you know, it's all part of our effort to get the information out there, and I really believe in sharing the material with people so that they can see firsthand how the films were marketed, and you know, it's also to correct a lot of mistakes. There's unfortunately a couple of books that were written years ago that contained a ton of errors about these films, and one in particular where the author, if he didn't have the information, he kind of fabricated theories and data to you know, present it in this book. And there's so much wrong information because now that's been copied online. If you go to IMDb or other sites, in many cases myth has become fact. So we wanted to really get as much factual data taken from primary source documents onto the site as possible, so that if somebody really wants to understand what 3D was, how it hit so fast, and why it burned out so quickly, they can just go to our site and click on any of the links to get the full story.
Well, I definitely recommend that. The website is just, you could be here all day, multiple days, and just find awesome new things that you could see. And it really is an archive, a digital archive that you can just see everything, how things were. So I definitely recommend it.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm sure you can imagine, it's been a lot of work, but again, it's something that I'm happy to do because I think sharing the information and getting it out there and accessible is really important. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, we're going to have a link to that in the description, and you can just go to there. Well, I guess that's going to be it for today, Bob, but thank you for everything, for this great podcast.
Adolph, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for your interest in 3D, and I will be happy to be available in the future if you'd like to talk again. I had a great time.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, so that's going to be it for this podcast.
We now have a Patreon, and the link is in the description. Thanks for watching.
And we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, little bit everywhere. Just look for us, 3D or 2D. And of course, review us on iTunes. And if you want to write us a letter, our email address is email3dortwo2d@gmail.com. So that's going to be it. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.